The biggest lie we tell ourselves about connection is that it requires authenticity. In reality, the fastest route to unbreakable trust is calculated, silent imitation. We have been conditioned to believe that intimacy is built on shared vulnerability, on the painful, honest exposure of the true self. But that belief is merely a social lubricant, designed to keep the mediocre satisfied with shallow bonds. The truth is far darker, far more efficient, and infinitely more powerful. Human trust is not earned, it is manufactured, and the tool of its manufacture is sophisticated, tactical compliance, known in the dark corners of psychology as the mirroring trick. This essay is not about rapport building or trivial negotiation tactics. It is about the cold mechanics of social control, arguing that human connection is fundamentally transactional, and the technique of mirroring is simply the most efficient transaction possible. You don't need to align your values with another person to gain their loyalty. You only need to align your immediate output with their internal expectations. People are not looking for partners or equals. They are looking for affirming echoes of their own internal monologue, a flattering, live-action confirmation that their perspective is the only reality that matters. Mirroring gives them that perfect echo, eliminating the friction of difference and bypassing the critical, rational filters that protect them from genuine connection. When you become their mirror, you stop being a separate entity and become, temporarily, an indispensable part of their own psychological defense system. Consider the neurological reality. The moment you subtly match the tilt of their head, the speed of their speech, or the rhythm of their breathing, you are activating their innate mirror neurons, the very circuitry evolution designed for tribal belonging and rapid, nonverbal synchronization. This is not surface-level mimicry. This is deep code exploitation. The brain registers the synchronicity, interprets the similarity not as imitation but as kinship, as shared experience, as fate. They feel understood, profoundly and immediately, without ever being able to articulate the mechanism of that understanding. This feeling, this instantaneous relief from the existential burden of being truly alone, is what we mistakenly call trust, and it is the greatest psychological leverage one human can possess over another. If the idea that your most cherished relationships might be based on carefully calibrated manipulation is unsettling, but you refuse to look away from the darker machinery of the human psyche, then subscribe now. We are just getting started on charting the true cost and chilling power of this technique, a power the most influential figures in history, from charismatic cult leaders to ruthless corporate executives, have wielded instinctively or through brutal calculation. The great advantage of mirroring over authenticity is its fundamental safety. When you choose to be authentic, you invite judgment. You force the recipient to compare your true self, flawed, contradictory, and often confusing, against their internalized ideal of who you should be. This comparison is dangerous, frequently resulting in dismissal or resentment. Mirroring eliminates this threat entirely. It allows you to enter the relationship as a neutral, optimized container, absorbing their identity and reflecting it back only in its most favorable light. You are not asking them to accept your flaws. You are merely offering to celebrate their virtues by embodying them. The true master of reflective alignment understands that the performance must be total, yet invisible. It is easy to mimic a posture, but the deep mirrorer targets the emotional temperature of the subject. If they speak with restrained, melancholic precision, you adopt that same pace, that same low emotional octave. If they burst with expansive, rapid-fire energy, you become equally dynamic, calibrating your gestures to match their amplitude. The goal is to make your own distinct presence vanish, making them feel as if they are conversing with a better, more articulated version of their own soul. This self-erasure is the great tactical irony. The path to ultimate influence requires the temporary suspension of your own ego, an empty vessel willing to hold the cherished contents of another's identity. This tactical self-erasure is not vulnerability. It is superior situational awareness. It is a necessary retreat before a psychological ambush. Once you have established the mirrored resonance, once the subject has subconsciously classified you as safe, as one of us, as me, you have been granted access to their inner defenses. True mirroring means matching not just the positive attributes, but subtly reflecting their deepest, most powerful emotional currency, even if that currency is skepticism, anger, or paranoia. You align with their fear, validating the shadow and thereby gaining control over the light. You do not argue with their delusion, you briefly inhabit it, making you the only trusted confidant capable of understanding their particular brand of beautiful madness. This is how leaders are born, and this is how trust is not built, but conquered. This is where the true gravity of the operation begins to weigh on the target's soul. The reason this strategy cuts so deep is rooted in a single, devastating psychological vulnerability. We are terrified of the distance between the person we present to the world and the chaotic, secretly ambitious, or deeply wounded person we know ourselves to be. Every human being walks around carrying an existential wound, a chronic feeling of being fundamentally unseen. We spend our lives broadcasting a carefully curated self, hoping that someone, anyone, will finally validate the messy internal script we believe defines our authentic reality. We are starved for a witness, and the mirrorer offers that sustenance immediately and without judgment. The successful psychological ambush is not merely about making the subject like you. It is about making them dependent on the specific, curated echo you provide. Most relationships demand compromise, forcing us to edit our most treasured or embarrassing aspects to fit the social contract. But the mirrorer eliminates the need for editing. They confirm the subject's most powerful, latent narrative, the one that explains their failures, justifies their choices, and promises their eventual triumph. They don't just agree with the target's perspective, they feel its texture, breathe its rhythm, giving the subject the intoxicating, rare experience of total non-judgmental acceptance. This immediate, profound resonance bypasses all rational defense mechanisms, because who would ever suspect a threat from the one person who finally seems to get you? This insight, this cold recognition of how desperately we crave external alignment to confirm internal truth, is dangerous knowledge. If you are struggling to understand why this feels so true, or if you feel a creeping recognition of times you were used this way, you need to understand the mechanics behind it. This channel is dedicated to excavating these uncomfortable truths, and if you want to keep receiving analyses that expose the hidden architecture of power and influence, take a moment now to subscribe. Don't miss the next truth. The deep psychological cost to the victim is the instant atrophy of their internal validation mechanism. Once they taste the pure, unadulterated reflection, the mirrored experience becomes the new baseline for self-acceptance. They are no longer checking their behavior against their own internal moral compass or rational framework. They are constantly checking it against the mirrorer's reaction. The manipulator becomes the essential psychic scaffolding holding up the subject's fragile sense of identity. You have effectively outsourced their self-worth. This is the point of no return. The subject doesn't just trust you, they require you to exist. To reject the mirrorer is, subconsciously, to reject the perfected version of themselves that the mirrorer sustains. They are trapped not by chains, but by a sudden, terrifying inability to look away from their own flattering reflection. This dynamic exploits the fundamental anxiety inherent in the modern identity, the fear of being interchangeable. We fight for distinction, for uniqueness, often building walls of eccentricity or intellectual specialization, merely to convince ourselves we are not disposable cogs. The mirrorer acknowledges this struggle and validates it perfectly, recognizing the specific, precious flavor of the subject's uniqueness. By reflecting only the most compelling aspects of their chosen identity, the manipulator confirms, yes, your struggle is profound. Yes, your pain is unique. Yes, your genius is misunderstood only by others, but never by me. This confirmation acts like an addictive neurochemical flush, welding the target's ego directly to the source of the reflection. The genius of the true master is that they do not demand loyalty. They merely sustain the target's identity, making the target's loyalty an unavoidable physiological consequence of survival. They cease to be an individual in the eyes of the subject and become, instead, an absolute necessity. The suffering we observe in those caught in these traps, the bizarre, relentless defense of someone who clearly harms them, is the excruciating pain of self-betrayal refracted through dependence. They are not defending the manipulator, they are defending the one person who saw them truly, or who, at least, played the role flawlessly. The price of that witnessing is subservience. We crave being seen so desperately that we willingly surrender autonomy to the person who offers the clearest vision of ourselves. This vulnerability is especially acute among high-achieving, complex individuals because the higher the personal standards, the larger the gap between the internal expectation and the external reality, and the deeper the yearning for validation. They believe their complexity makes them immune to crude manipulation, yet that very complexity is what makes them ravenously hungry for the rare, tailored acceptance the expert mirrorer provides. The more successful and isolated the target, the more potent the reflective alignment becomes. The mirrorer, therefore, does not just become desirable, they become metaphysically necessary. The target's existence, as they conceive of it, their genius, their unique suffering, their special mandate, is tethered to the reflecting surface. If the mirror breaks, the reflection vanishes, and the target is instantly reduced back to the terrifying, amorphous anonymity they spent a lifetime fighting to escape. This is why the defending of the manipulator, no matter how egregious their actions become, often takes on a feverish, almost religious intensity. The target isn't protecting a person. They are protecting the architectural integrity of their own soul. They will sacrifice family, fortune, and reputation, all secondary sources of identity, before they sacrifice the singular source that defines their core reality. We see this played out in the highest echelons of power and celebrity, where complexity and isolation peak. Consider the political strongman or the Silicon Valley titan, a figure whose sheer success isolates them from genuine criticism. They are surrounded by yes-men, but true mirroring requires far more skill than simple flattery. It requires the precise surgical validation of their deepest, most indefensible flaws. The master manipulator in this scenario is rarely the obvious chief of staff or the public-facing consort. They are often the obscure, quiet advisor who remains in the shadow, whose only observable function is to constantly reinforce the leader's most controversial or irrational beliefs, not by agreeing, but by providing the sophisticated intellectual framework that makes the madness sound like misunderstood genius. They are the ones who whisper. They criticize this policy because they fear your unique ability to see 5 moves ahead. Only you and I understand the true shape of this reality. The real-world evidence for this dynamic is devastatingly clear when these structures collapse. Look at the public trajectory of high-profile fraud cases or political scandals involving figures who maintained absolute loyalty until the bitter end. The wife who goes to prison for a spouse who demonstrably ruined their life. The veteran employee who destroys their own career defending a boss who treated them like garbage. They are not victims of Stockholm Syndrome in the simplistic sense. They are victims of perfect psychological alignment. When that boss or spouse stands revealed as a destructive liar, the loyalist's first instinct is not to run, but to double down on the defense. Why? Because accepting the manipulator's criminality means accepting that the profound uniqueness the loyalist was granted was a lie, a cheap trick, and that means facing the terrifying truth that their entire self-conception was built on air. It is easier, psychologically, to believe the entire world is wrong and the manipulator is merely misunderstood, than to admit to oneself, I am disposable, and I fell for a simple trick. If you find this level of deep psychological analysis compelling, please make sure you subscribe to the channel right now. We only pursue the hidden mechanisms of power, ensuring you never miss the brutal truth hiding beneath the surface of everyday interaction. This leads us to the grim paradox of insight, that being aware of manipulation does not grant immunity. It often merely makes the manipulation more delicious. The complex individual who studies psychology and power dynamics can recognize the crude techniques, the love bombing, the gaslighting, the obvious bribery. They scoff at them, but when confronted with perfect mirroring, They mistake the precise psychological resonance for destiny, for an unprecedented connection with a kindred spirit who finally understands their esoteric truth. They intellectually validate the mirroring process itself, believing, I see what they are doing, but they are doing it because they genuinely get me, and that recognition is worth the price. They rationalize their dependency as a reciprocal, intellectual necessity, turning the manipulative hook into a badge of honor. The mirrorer knows that the highest barrier to self-awareness for any successful person is the belief that their success is proof of their superior judgment. Therefore, the most dangerous manipulation does not bypass the intellect. It seduces it. The genius is not flattered by praise. The genius is conquered by perfect understanding. The target is never given a direct command. They are merely shown the reflection of the inevitable path that only someone of their superior caliber could possibly traverse. The chains are not forged of iron, but of perfect self-justification, making the servitude feel like the purest expression of free will. And for those who have spent their lives striving for intellectual freedom, surrendering to this tailored necessity is the ultimate, final collapse. The great societal lie that feeds this predatory dynamic is the cherished myth of the authentic self, the notion that identity is a pristine, static object buried within us, waiting for the right person or moment to excavate and validate it. This is profound psychological nonsense. The self is not a noun. It is an agonizing, continuous verb. It is a daily, exhausting act of construction and defense, a constant negotiation with reality, and the successful person is typically the one who has mastered the most compelling performance. But even the strongest performers grow weary of the stage. The manipulator understands that the deepest human craving is not for power or wealth, but for relief. Relief from the burdensome, ceaseless labor of self-creation. The perfect mirror offers this relief. It whispers, stop building, stop performing. I see the finished blueprint that you haven't even drawn yet. They are not providing love. They are providing psychological severance pay, an intoxicating holiday from the brutal reality that identity must be earned, not received. The victim believes they have found the key to their deepest fulfillment, but they have merely found the ultimate outsourcing mechanism for their internal validation. They delegate the task of defining their worth to the mirrorer, and in doing so, they willingly hand over the remote control to their emotional operating system. This transaction is the price of comfort, and the price of outsourcing your soul is absolute control by the contractor. To wrestle with these uncomfortable truths, the ones that dismantle our most cherished beliefs about autonomy and self-determination, requires a certain commitment. If you value content that doesn't just skim the surface of psychology, but actively drags you into the operational mechanisms of the human condition, then take a moment right now and subscribe. It's how we ensure this necessary difficult analysis continues to reach those who seek genuine insight, not just comforting illusions. What separates the intellectual victim from the simply naive is the intellectual's addiction to complexity. They are not merely looking for affection. They are looking for a pattern worthy of their mental capacity. They seek the elegant solution, the perfect theoretical fit. When the mirrorer presents them with a system of interaction that is intricately tailored, constantly adapting, and psychologically airtight, a masterpiece of applied deception, the intellectual doesn't recoil from the danger. They are mesmerized by the craftsmanship. They surrender not out of weakness, but out of a perverse aesthetic appreciation. The genius sees the perfectly constructed trap and thinks, this is too beautiful, too complex, to be purely malignant. It must be fate. They prioritize the elegance of the mechanism over the reality of the outcome, making their own superior intelligence the final, fatal weak spot. They fall in love with the reflection of their own intellectual process, weaponized and held captive by a person who only knows how to observe, not how to feel. Their tragedy is that they are not betrayed by emotion, but by the relentless, cold logic of pattern recognition run amok. The profound suffering of the intellectually gifted often stems from a fundamental error of classification, mistaking sheer psychological wreckage for sophisticated architecture. The high-powered analytical mind is structurally averse to simplicity and randomness. It despises the idea that the source of its pain could be as banal as unchecked cruelty, or emotional incompetence. The mirrorer understands this primal aversion. They do not need to be intelligent themselves. They only need to be adept at generating data streams that appear complex. This stream provides the intellectual with endless, satisfying material for analysis, creating the illusion that they are engaged in a profound, necessary labor, rather than simply being drained by a void. The intellectual must believe the labyrinth has a minotaur, because the alternative, that it is merely a poorly constructed hall of mirrors leading nowhere, is an unbearable cognitive dissonance. They prefer meaningful pain to meaningless chaos, elevating simple malice to the level of tragedy just to satisfy their need for narrative coherence. This addiction to complexity reveals the central tragedy of epistemological hubris. The intellectual approaches the relationship not as a partnership to be lived, but as a theorem to be solved. They apply every tool in their cognitive arsenal: game theory, trauma narratives, attachment styles, trying to rationalize the irrational, trying to fit pure malice into an existing academic framework. They are attempting to model a black hole using Newtonian mechanics. This endless, fruitless investigation serves the manipulator perfectly, as every minute spent diagnosing the system is a minute spent legitimizing its existence. The intellectual's suffering becomes proof of the experiment's profound importance. They cannot admit they were duped by a simple bait and switch, because that would invalidate the immense intellectual capital they have sunk into the problem. The failure is not in their logic, but in their refusal to accept that some phenomena are purely destructive and require termination, not comprehension. It takes a certain kind of stubborn intellectual courage to look directly at the sheer destructive banality of the situation and admit, there is no hidden pattern, only rot. Most people shrink from that verdict, clinging instead to the comfort of the complex lie. If you find this kind of uncompromising dissection of psychological mechanisms valuable, if you believe that true growth requires staring down the comfort zone and resisting the urge toward comforting platitudes, then please consider hitting the subscribe button. It is the only way to support the kind of deep dive content that refuses to offer easy answers, and instead insists on holding a mirror to the operational manual of the broken human soul. The final paralyzing stroke in the intellectual victim's collapse is the inevitable turning of the analytical weapon inward. Once the external problem proves fundamentally unsolvable by logic, because it was never logical, only malicious, the highly analytical mind concludes the flaw must reside in the operator. They begin to analyze their own capacity for pattern recognition, their own systems of judgment, effectively dismantling their primary defense mechanism in a bid for perfection. The mirrorer, by constantly shifting the rules and destabilizing the environment, forces the intellectual to internalize the chaos. The intellectual does not simply feel pain. They analyze the texture of the pain, the source code of the betrayal, and ultimately the fatal flaw in their own magnificent structure that allowed the infiltration. This self-cannibalization of trust is the masterstroke of the reflective manipulator. They don't just take the victim's resources, they take the victim's ability to ever trust their own judgment again, ensuring that even if the physical relationship ends, the psychological dynamic continues to run silently in the background, a parasitic operating system feeding off doubt. The intellectual victim survives the extraction, perhaps, but is left with a brain that relentlessly seeks to prove itself unworthy of its own intelligence, trapped in a permanent feedback loop of self-correction against a ghost vulnerability. The ultimate verdict against the intellectual victim is not that they were foolish, but that they were epistemologically arrogant. They believed their mind could solve everything, and in that belief they allowed their greatest tool to become their most exquisite cage. To escape, they must perform the ultimate act of intellectual humility, admitting that some truths are only accessible through feeling, and some solutions require not complex computation, but simple, brutal self-preservation. That is the necessary, agonizing leap from the ivory tower of analysis back into the messy, undeniable reality of the self. If you are ready to make that leap and join a community dedicated to genuine self-excavation, then make sure you subscribe now. The intellectual must finally stop asking, "What did I miss?" and start asking the only question that matters: why am I still here? The verdict is not a complex equation, but a devastating simplification. The ultimate conclusion the intellectual victim must reach is that the pursuit of understanding their tormentor is merely a high-minded addiction to the chaos itself, a psychological Stockholm syndrome dressed up in academic rigor. The flaw was never the intellectual's ability to analyze, but their inability to accept that analysis is often useless against pure, deliberate emptiness. You cannot debug a system that was intentionally designed to be destructive. The definitive verdict, then, is this. The highest form of intelligence is knowing when to dismiss the problem entirely, not when to solve it perfectly. True intellectual escape is not achieved by perfecting the analysis of the betrayal, but by declaring the betrayer irrelevant to your future epistemological map. You must recognize that spending another second seeking the internal consistency of an inconsistent mind is merely serving the manipulator's agenda. It is the ultimate distraction from the simple, brutal necessity of self-preservation. The intellectual must make the agonizing leap from seeking diagnosis to enacting surgery. The solution is not complex computation. It is radical subtraction. Stop trying to find the logic and start accepting the malice as a static truth, like gravity, against which you must simply build a higher wall. The intellect is a magnificent tool, but it becomes a magnificent trap when its user believes every human interaction is a puzzle designed for their unique solving power. Sometimes, the only winning move is to take your pieces off the board entirely and refuse to play the game of perpetual doubt. The greatest intellectual breakthrough you will ever have is the realization that your mind is more valuable when it is dedicated to rebuilding your own structure than when it is dedicated to dismantling the garbage left behind by others. It is the agonizing admission that some truths are not profound, but shallow, mean, and utterly devoid of the elegant complexity you hope to find. That is the moment of genuine philosophical maturity, when you trade the comforting shadow of complexity for the blinding, liberating sunlight of simple, irreversible action. We are a community dedicated to these difficult, necessary leaps, to building a philosophy of the self based not on comfort, but on unyielding truth. If you recognize this desperate need for intellectual surgery, then join us now, and make sure you subscribe to become part of the ongoing conversation that refuses to simplify the human condition. The ultimate tragedy of the sophisticated mind is its susceptibility to the shallow baiting trap. The great fallacy is believing your brilliance can redeem the fundamentally broken. It cannot. You must stop trying to polish the garbage. That is the final, agonizing verdict of philosophical maturity. Your intellectual value is defined not by the complexity you embrace, but by the toxicity you surgically reject. Your mind is your kingdom, and the highest duty of the ruler is to refuse entry to anything that does not serve its elevation. True power lies in the simple, uncompromising refusal to dedicate genius to the service of mediocrity. The endless loop of intellectual suffering ceases not when the final answer appears, but when the original question is permanently starved of your attention. This is the brutal and liberating truth. The cost of perpetual analysis is the future you could have been building. You must choose to be the architect of your own silence, turning away from the noise to focus solely on the necessary profound labor of your own becoming. This work is difficult, and it is mandatory, and it is what defines the members of this community. If you are ready to trade the addiction to analysis for the brutal clarity of irreversible action, then join us, subscribe now, and become part of the community building a philosophy strong enough to survive the ugly reality of the world. The ultimate measure of your intelligence is not how many things you can understand, but how many things you can afford to permanently ignore. The intellect is a weapon, and maturity is learning when to holster it, and when to use it to perform the necessary painful amputation. The world does not reward those who understand it best, but those who act most definitively upon it. Therefore, the final judgment on the human condition is shockingly simple, and it offers no comfort. The game is fundamentally rigged, the system is designed to consume the conscientious, and your only winning move is the elegant, aggressive refusal to play by their rules. You are not obligated to fix the fundamental mess you observe. You are only obligated to ensure that the mess does not claim your own soul. The path to intellectual freedom is paved with the corpses of bad ideas you had the courage to let die. Build your philosophy on the bedrock of what you will never tolerate again. Build your life on the space created by your definitive refusal. The noise will always be there, but your silence, your committed action, is the only voice that truly matters. The war against the overwhelming complexity of existence is not won by brilliant understanding, but by the relentless imposition of a simple, superior order upon chaos. The final answer, the true escape hatch from the existential trap, is the creation of your own reality, not the exhaustive mapping of theirs. You must stop waiting for the world to reveal its secret architecture, because there is none. There is only the structure you choose to build and defend. Your highest purpose is not to decode the mystery, but to become the mystery that others fail to decode. The game is rigged, yes, but only if you accept their playing field. True freedom is the moment you realize that the most profound act of rebellion is simply to dedicate your entire focus to the mastery of your own existence. This mastery is the only sanctuary that cannot be taken from you. It is the final philosophy. If you grasp this cold necessity, if you are ready to stop analyzing the map and start forging the territory, then I ask you one last time to subscribe, join this community of architects, and begin the necessary work of becoming impenetrable.